I was just thinking about pilot episodes and how they're usually really awkward and overall kind of dodgy quality. Welcome to Mike's Book Report. Today we're looking at the ancient Star Wars book, Splinter of the Mind's Eye. As I started reading it, there was a lot of internet discourse about canon, and it influenced my opinion of the book a little bit, which we'll get into. Alan Dean Foster, who wrote the novelization of Star Wars, he was asked to write a sequel story with an eye toward maybe a low-budget film, in case the box office returns on Star Wars ended up being less than stellar. So he created the swampy, foggy planet Mimban. Not a lot of spaceships in the story, not too many complex aliens, but enough adventure to fill a pulp novel or a B-movie. Of course, Star Wars was a massive hit, so they did the pulp novel. And it was a good idea because they needed something to fill time until Star Wars 2 came out. You know, something that wasn't the holiday special.
I'm getting your message. Are you getting mine? Oh.
Of course, we know Star Wars 2 wouldn't come out for another 22 years, but that's another story. Quick rundown of some elements of the plot. I'm not going to spoil the whole thing, but I do want to get into a little bit of the story. So Luke and Leia are on their way to a meeting with a potential new rebel cell on the planet Serkarpus 4. Serkarpus 4. So they end up crash landing there because there's this energy output coming off of Serkarpus 5, which is known locally as Mimban. Due to the mining operation, there's like some energy output that ends up going into space and knocking their ships down out of the sky. And they end up crash landing on Mimban. So they discover this mining operation, and while they blend in as miners to investigate a way off the planet, they find the bar, because there's always a bar. There's these locals in the bar called Greenies. They're these aliens who are addicted to alcohol, and the miners give them small quantities of alcohol and, you know, make them lick it off the floor, and it's kind of gross. And then Luke talks with the miners, and he has to come up with a cover story, and his cover story is that he's a new miner in town.
I'm new in town.
And Leia is his servant, so he has to smack her around in public a little bit. These moments are pretty gross. Then they meet Hala, an old woman who senses the Force in Luke, and she shows him a shard of what appears to be a gemstone of some kind, the Kyber crystal, which is not a $5,000 cocktail, but it's a relic that can focus and increase a person's Force abilities and powers. She asks for their help in finding the rest of the crystal. Leia thinks Hala is a crazy person, but the old woman does have mild Force powers, because Luke can sense that and the power of both her and the crystal. So upon leaving the bar, Luke and Leia get into an argument and end up in the mud. Some passing miners notice this and decide to break up the fight, with some threatening implications towards the muddy but still beautiful princess, who, remember, is still posing as Luke's servant. These moments are pretty gross. The pair managed to fight off the miners, but in the end, the whole fracas is broken up by stormtroopers, and they're shipped off to Captain Supervisor Grammel. Grammel's a pretty typical Imperial stooge to some degree. The usual levels of cruelty and toadying to superiors, but he's kind of on the smart side. He imprisons our heroes while investigating their identities and taking a look at the shard that Luke was carrying. So he calls up an Imperial Governor, Bin Asada, who is known to be an expert on such things. Bin Asada realizes very quickly that Grammel stumbled onto bigger things than he's equipped to handle, and tells Grammel that help is on the way. That help is Darth Vader, by the way, which isn't a spoiler because he's on the cover. enjoying this video, why not buy my book? Flight of the Pangolin is the story of an intrepid group of heroes who decide to exit the solar system over the objections of an isolationist faction. There's actually a lot more going on than that. There's space pirates, a giant spider for no reason, all kinds of other things. Buy it now online wherever you buy books or at our website, www.thepangolinrepublic.com. You can also get fun t-shirts and random other stuff if you want. Meanwhile, what? Oh, you want me to pick you up? Okay. This is Max. Max just got a haircut. Say hi, Max. Hey. Hello. Yes. Okay. He is not interested in being on camera. Yep. Okay. I'll put you down. Meanwhile, our heroes are imprisoned with two Yuzum, not to be confused with Yuzum, an entirely different race of furry Star Wars aliens. They're a couple of freelance miners with hangovers. They do not speak Basic, but Luke handily speaks and understands their language, which is convenient. They work together to engineer a prison break in which Grammel is injured. They steal a land crawler, and they escape into the swamps to search for the legendary Temple of Pomojima, where the Kyber crystal waits for them. Along the way, they fight a massive beast called a Wandrella, and encounter a race of locals separate from the Greenies called the Koei. They are your typical fierce warrior tribesmen. Then Grammel shows up with Darth Vader, all hell breaks loose, and I'm not going to spoil the ending, just the first 2/3 of the book. Oh, and C-3PO and R2-D2 are in this book, but do absolutely nothing. 3PO never translates anything, even though there are translation opportunities. R2 never has anything to do. They're just there. I'm not even sure why. Alright, so let's address the question that I kind of posed at the beginning.
Was it canon?
Is this book still canon somehow? Could it be? Maybe? It's not Disney canon, we know this. We know it's not Disney canon. But I will say that nothing in this book violates mainline, expanded universe, or Disney canon, or any of that until about 1980. And then again in 1983. Until then, it's a story that could have happened between Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. Among the eventual canon violations are, there's a good deal of implied budding romance between Luke and Leia, because at this point in canon, of course, there would be. And when Vader meets up with Luke and Leia, he knows exactly who they are, but clearly is not interested in Luke as a family member. And there are multiple instances where Leia is explicitly stated to have no Force connection or abilities whatsoever. Canon marches on, and that's okay. Some people like their continuing stories to follow a consistent continuity. Other people don't mind if the stories coast along on vibes. I am somewhere in the middle on this, and I think wherever on the spectrum you fall is fine. But here's a test to see if you may need professional help regarding canon. If you're bothered by the canonicity of Mon Calamari wearing cable knit sweaters, if this leads you to rail against the great beast internet on the socials, you need to go outside and, as the kids would say, touch grass. Back to the book. The characters. Luke and Leia are pretty much who we expect, though there are moments of immaturity for both of them, which I actually kind of liked, because it reminds us that for all their accomplishments and responsibilities, they're barely adults. Their dialogue isn't quite true to the films, but this might just be a side effect of Alan Dean Foster being better at dialogue than George Lucas. Even though Hala was sort of described as human in the book, my head wanted her to be an alien, and I sort of pictured her as something like Aughra from the Dark Crystal. I don't know why. This would make her a little bit closer to being like a Yoda-type character, which this book was kind of missing. Overall, Hala wasn't my favorite, but she was okay. She was fine. The Yuzums are basically Chewbacca stand-ins. Captain Supervisor Grammel started out okay, And even though he was described as being physically very different from him, my head read his dialogue in David Warner's voice for some reason. I guess because, David Warner is like the king of the intelligent bad guy speeches.
Of digital watches. And soon I shall have understanding of video cassette recorders and car telephones.
But I suppose they could have ignored the book's description and cast him in the film version if there had been one. But he really only has a few scenes of any importance, and they're like right in the middle. I guess it's about as much work as David Warner had in Star Trek V, so I don't know. There's also a really interesting scene between Grammel and his doctor, which tried to humanize the doctor, and by extension at least some of the Empire, as people working within the system to help where they can. It was a little bit of complexity that I haven't seen much in Star Wars outside of like Andor or Clerks. Overall, the book was okay. If you're looking for a Star Wars story with some epic sweep, this is not it. But if you want a quick read that has some historical value, and you don't care about canon, it's not a bad time. Join us next time when we talk about my favorite ship in all of Star Trek and the book it's in. Okay, bye.